Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. Ko Sue McCabe au, kei toputanga tuku aroha o Aotearoa ahau e mahi ana. Hello everybody and welcome to this session. I'm Sue McCabe from Philanthropy New Zealand. Ngā mihi nui kia koe, Minister Poto Williams. Warm greetings to you, Minister. Thank you so much for your time at what is a very intense and busy period. The first televised leaders debate last night always seems to signal a ratcheting up of campaigning. Minister Poto Williams is the MP for Christchurch East and has been in Parliament since 2013. She is the Minister for the Community and Voluntary Sector and is Associate Minister for Greater Christchurch Regeneration, Immigration and Social Development portfolios. It does feel relevant to mention the Minister's professional life before politics, as she is known and respected for her links, some due to her career but also wider community involvement with the not-for-profit sector. So Minister Williams has worked for the Ministry of Education, Birthright, Healthcare New Zealand and disability agencies. And she moved from Auckland to Christchurch to take up a position as Regional Manager of the St John of God Hauora Trust, and resigned from that role during the election campaign to successfully focus on the election. Before I turn over to the Minister to introduce herself in the way that she chooses to and start putting questions to Minister Williams, I'll quickly run through today's purpose and format. So this session is the final of 3 webinars that we're holding. We've talked to National Social Development and Social Investment spokesperson Louise Upston, and the Tangata Whenua Community and Voluntary Sector spokesperson, amongst other portfolios, Jan Logie for the Greens. Yesterday, Philanthropy New Zealand's Research and Policy Manager and myself met with the current Internal Affairs and Children's Minister Tracy Martin from New Zealand First, and we talked to her about New Zealand First party policies of interest to the philanthropic and grant-making sector, and we are also seeking information from the ACT Party. We have started an Election 2020 page on our website where we are putting relevant information from party policies. We'll start promoting this page more heavily after today's webinar is being recorded, and we've distilled some key summary points from this talk to add as text to that page. Now, in addition to providing this information around policies to the sector, the purpose of our engagement with political party spokespeople is to identify shared objectives between philanthropy and whoever is the government of the day or a future government down the track, so that Philanthropy New Zealand can achieve its mission to grow philanthropy within Aotearoa and improve the quality of giving, and also to make sure that the ecosystem is strong and promotes giving. The PNZ over the last year has expanded its capability into this policy space thanks to funding from the Community Trust, and we've been solidly working with government agencies and increasing our political engagement. And Minister, we do have to say that we find the Department of Internal Affairs, one of your key ministries, just absolutely excellent and accessible to deal with. So we believe that philanthropy working with government is critical to having maximum impact, and you know, in order for both the government and philanthropy and grant making to achieve their objectives, particularly around the system change space. The size of the challenges and the opportunities means that no one sector can do it alone. We do need to work together. So the agenda today is that we're going to put 3 main questions to the Minister. We have pre-shared a briefing with the Minister on our sector and around areas of interest. Then we'll move into a discussion. So to the audience, please ask questions via the Q&A function. While this recording will be publicly available, you won't show up, your questions won't show up. However, anything you put in the chat function will actually be able to be seen when we make this recording available. So just in terms of guidance for you on that. Okay, so thank you again, Minister. I'm going to put the first of the 3 questions to you and invite yourself to introduce yourself a little bit more. So the first question is, how do you see the respective roles of government, philanthropy and the community sector?
Kia ora ana koutou katoa, tōna roto te aroa mata o Tētua. Kia ora e mihi mahana ki a koutou katoa, ki runga I te kaupapa o tēnei rā. Thank you for having me on. It's a beautiful day here in Christchurch, and I'm here in this room meeting with you because it's really important, the work that you do and the work that we do to support our communities to thrive. I think where I want to go with this particular question, because it's really interesting, that COVID has given us an opportunity really to think about how we build sustainability into our community sector, and it's given us also the opportunity to look and see what is community and how do you help communities to thrive, and where do those relationships sit. I think the beauty of, the silver lining that has come out of COVID has been the ability of organisations to quickly pivot to do what's necessary when situations change. And the ability for government to also respond really quickly without those mechanisms that we have put in place for business as usual, that mean that, applications are required and due diligence and all of that stuff. So COVID has taught us that we can actually do things in a much, much more high trust way than perhaps we would do at business as usual times. And one of the things that came out of conversations that, thank you, Sue, Philanthropy New Zealand helped me and my team engage in, is that the opportunity for us to work collectively has never been more important than it is right now. And I can recall, the conversations that we had, the thing that I really want to promote is the thought that, government policy really often is directed by the party in power, or the parties in power. What we should be thinking about is our relationship with the community, people that deliver services and, do the delivery arm kind of thing, or people who are advocating, or people who are in the community. The people who fund that, the people who sit, behind and support that as well, whether that's business or others. There needs to be a better mechanism to direct government policy, because there's no doubt that government leads a lot of the work that happens, but it's not always as well informed as it should be. So how do you do that? And I think that one of the things that we really need to do is create the structure where communities are directing the work of government, and that government actually is working with philanthropics and with other funders to then set the priorities according to the needs that communities identify. And then we're held accountable for that. But what that also requires is for communities to think about what those priorities are. And therein lies the rub, because it may be that we're not able to fund everything, or we need to find other ways to support some of the areas which may not be as prescient as others. But I think it's possible. I think we're a mature enough society to have those conversations. I know that the government is, the current government has already made moves to that regard, and there are a couple of pieces of legislation that are really important in this, and that is the Public Finance Act and the reform to that, and how we can make government funding much more targeted to need and to purpose than it is currently, and the reform of the State Sector Act, and how we can allow public service to be more about service and less about managing the sector. So, I'm hopeful. I've spoken about this for many years, I think, now is the opportunity for us to formalise some of the good stuff that came out organically over COVID, the destruction of those silos, the ability to have work much more high trust with our service deliverers and people who are providing those, and also to break down the requirement to report in stringent ways and apply in stringent ways. I think there's lots of opportunity for that.
Thank you, Minister. And I am just going to follow up on your answer before we get on to that next set question, because you've raised such an important point. So I know that a lot of our members are really interested in that community development approach and love the idea if decision making can be a bit more devolved, which would also more easily enable place-based funders and funders of interest to sit around the table with government and community, to have a bit more of a comprehensive approach and a multi-sector approach. And you mentioned some legislation, including the Public Finance Act. I don't think it's well understood what the barriers are at the moment to the government just doing that. Why haven't we seen it? And how do those bits of legislation like the Public Finance Act, how would they better enable that kind of community development approach from a government perspective?
So if I can explain, the way government funds things currently is you might have $1 of health and $1 of justice and $1 of education, and unfortunately you have to report that dollar back through education, health and justice as an example. But the person who is sitting in front of you, or the issue that is sitting in front of you, is not about $1 of this, and there is a whole complexity that sits around people who are looking for support or advice or whatever. So how is it that we are able to be much more about the outcome that you want to achieve and less about how we account for those individual buckets? That requires we started this process by having wellbeing budgets, for example, and Treasury, bless them, have come along the journey with us in terms of, I always get this wrong, I always have to think about the living standards framework, sorry, and so that's their way of accounting for the things that we think are really important, which is, government should be more than just about, building bridges and schools and stuff. It actually should be about supporting the well-being of our people. So how do we put that organic stuff kind of into a measurement framework? And Treasury has come up with that. The other thing I want to say about that too is, the devolvement of decision making down to communities. Everybody will recall how the furore that was created when we wanted to make changes, for example, to the way COGS happened. Now that is, local communities making decisions for themselves about how grants and funding was allocated. That, the reason that people were so vocal about that is that actually speaks much more to addressing local need than kind of any other model that we've got. So there's an opportunity for us to pick up the sentiment of that and weave that into the living standards framework, and so that we can meet the agendas for the wellbeing agenda. But alongside that, really say that we don't do this alone, and that our funders, our trusts often have a much better handle on what's going on in the communities, because they fund based on what people at the grassroots tell them. And that's, I think, we've got a real opportunity to leverage off that knowledge that trusts and philanthropics, for example, have, that we perhaps don't quite have yet.
Great, thank you. I think every sector has a different lens over what is occurring, and if you can add all that together, it's a much better picture. Yeah. So the next question was around the briefing that we provided to you, outlined some areas of interest for the community and voluntary sector, and we're interested in imputation credit refunds for philanthropists and grant makers. So that's where effectively there is an unintended consequence of philanthropic funders paying tax. Greater representation for the community and voluntary sector, not just at the government department level, but that is important, but also at that political level. Philanthropy, as we've discussed, seeks to work more closely with government for the good of those that we, effectively co-fund, and how do we do that, and how would we take a step forward under the next government to do that. The sector is obviously quite impacted by the funding gap between what government funds the community and voluntary sector to deliver in terms of important services and the cost of providing those services, which is a very long-standing issue, and the importance of volunteering, and also the government's current review of gaming funding. So those are some of the areas of interest. And with other parties, we've obviously asked what their policy response is to those going forward, and also interested in terms of being in the current government, what achievements or progress you've made in some of those areas.
Well, let's start with the voluntary sector. Well, let's start with volunteers, because there are a huge component to the work that we do, and I've made a commitment that I want for government to develop a strategy on volunteering. How do we recruit them and retain them and reward them and acknowledge what they do, but how do we leverage off the value that they bring to the sector, and the value that they have as the value that volunteering provides to them as individuals as well. So having a strategy, which we haven't done before, coming out to the sector to talk about what that should look like, that's something that I had been talking with people in the background, with officials, about what that might look like. So that's something I definitely hope to kick off, should we be fortunate to be in that position. And should I be fortunate enough to hold that portfolio again, which, I'd really like that. I think one of the things about this particular portfolio is it tends to get kicked around every 16 months or so, that there has been a lack of consistency of minister, and that doesn't speak well to its value within government. So I have already had conversations. Should we be successful and in a position, I would dearly love to continue being the minister, because there are some things that are unfinished. I know that the conversation that we had as a sector about the big piece of work that was started under PNZ that we reported back, but really didn't kind of get to the nub of some of the key concerns of the sector. Stuff like advocacy, stuff like retention of earnings for organisations, stuff like reporting requirements through XRB, but most importantly, what happened to the whole discussion around first principle review. I mean, I know when this first came up as a thing that was happening under Minister Henarez's watch, that was, despite the fact it was kind of taken off the table, it was the thing that everybody wanted. Most of the responses were about first principles review. When you're reviewing charities legislation, shouldn't you look at the basic reason that it's there? And I look, I've had to sit on my hands a little bit about that. I've had many conversations in the background about why that didn't happen, and I've not received a suitable response from anyone in the Department of Internal Affairs about why that shouldn't happen. So that's something that we really want to do. You know, why would you modernise legislation without looking at first principles? And it is something I'm committed to do. I've been committed as a community person to doing that. So that is something that's back on the agenda for us. But importantly, how is legislation going to help us as a community to be sustainable and successful? You know, that seems to me we need to think about, when we're thinking about first principles, we need to think about things like the social enterprise part of this component as well. So when you're looking at, you know, you talked about the unfortunate byproduct where philanthropics, you know, have, you know, tax implications. When we're looking at social enterprise as well, aren't we having this conversation? Isn't this kind of the other end of the sector? Should we not you know, look at charities and social enterprise, and the reforms need to include that, because there's no doubt when we talk about the funding shortfalls, the ability for organisations to self-fund through enterprise has to be part of the conversation, because, you know, some of the gap can be made up through that. And we all know as community organisations, when you have untagged funds that you can do with what you feel you need without having to report, you know, trying to make funding fit the purpose or altering purpose to fit funding is never a useful or sustainable way for organisations to be. So how do we bring that social enterprise component into the discussion? And when we're talking about tax and when we're talking about those kinds of things, we need to have that as part of the conversation. I think the other thing is the relationships we build with, as government, with funders needs to be much more in partnership, you know, setting those priorities as communities determine, coming together and seeing how it is that we can support that, helping community organisations to self-fund through social enterprise. All of these things are part of the answer to those very complex issues that you raised. At the same time, providing opportunities for individuals to to donate into the sector as well. So still retaining that notion of trust and confidence, and that's where I know some of the tension has occurred, you know, with the regulator perhaps being, the regulator really needs to understand the sector. And I think the sector needs to also have some trust and confidence in the regulator, and that's probably partly the role of whoever has this particular job as minister. That, you know, the community feels that they can speak into the issues that have, you know, that the regulator then uses, but sometimes to hit the community sector over the head. And, you know, and advocacy is a case in point that community organisations should be able to advocate for the causes and the people that they support. So that's, I think, a basic right of community organisations. How have I done there? Is there the stuff I haven't covered off?
That is great. I am going to probably press you a little bit on that Charities Act review, though. Yeah. It is a little bit of an elephant in the room for the sector, because the community and voluntary sector put massive effort into responding to the government's call for input into that. Philanthropy and grant making funded quite a bit of that voice. They were concerned initially that it was going to be too inaccessible. You know, some of Philanthropy New Zealand put resource and time into responding to that call. And, you know, I heard in there a little bit around the actions of DIA, but my understanding is it is the government that determined what the boundaries of that review were, not DIA. So you know, there hasn't been progress. The sector has put massive time and resource into that. So what is the commitment in the next term of government around continuing that work, given all the effort that's been put into it by the Department of Internal Affairs as well as the community and voluntary sector?
Yeah, can I be perfectly frank? And you know, this is within our four walls, right? And all the people that are listening, can I be perfectly frank that I don't feel that the department invested enough resource in the actual work. You know, I came into the piece of work after it had been, you know, going for a year or so. And, you know, I don't think that our department did a good enough job at honouring the huge levels of investment, you know, not just financial investment, but the huge levels of investment that the community and all of you invested in that. And that's my honest view. You know, I have now had many conversations with the Honourable Tracy Martin about the investment of resource by DIA into the community and voluntary sector. And there's talk about, you know, people ask about whether we should have an office or a department. What we need is the resource, the appropriate allocations from DIA to do the work, and we just haven't had that. So, you know, I've had the commitment from Tracy, should she come back and be successful, that she will she absolutely values the work of the community, and she values the responses that were made, and COVID has been the illuminator to all of this. So to be perfectly fair, you know, our officials have done an extraordinary job on the resource that they've had, but they haven't been resourced to do this properly or well, which is part of the reason that I think that big nuggety bit around first principles wasn't included in the first draft. That's, to be perfectly honest, and yeah, I've got commitments to make sure that we are resourced and we do that. We finish off this work and honour the actual commitments made by everybody.
Great, thank you for that. So in summary, that in the next term of government, and that actually fits with what we talked to Tracy Martin just yesterday about, that there is a commitment to increase resourcing for this area, and so that the work will be honoured, because it's there now, the feedback is there, it's time to turn it into the policy advice and then into the decisions. So
yeah, absolutely. And you know, I want to thank Tracy for starting that work behind the scenes too, to make sure that our sector is resourced so that we can do, you know, we can finish this off in the way that it should have been started in the first place. You know, we can do justice and honour to the work that has been done already and complete this piece of work.
Thank you, Minister, and also acknowledging that you came into the role as the Community and Voluntary Sector Minister partway through the review as well, so inherited a lot of that. So thank you for that. So this is your chance to, in terms of any other Labour Party policies that support more or better philanthropy and a stronger community and voluntary sector that you think our members might be interested in.
Oh, well, look, I had some conversations with Stuart Nash, our Minister of Revenue, who's very keen to support the encouragement of people donating into the sector, to support you know, organisations that have, you know, resource that comes into it. How do we do that much better? And part of the work that that he's doing is looking at bringing some fairer rules into play, but also recognising that that we have got this burgeoning social enterprise component that also needs to be acknowledged and supported. And how can we do that to fairly, you know, we're in a modern age where where information flows quite quickly, where we can do things rapidly, and we still kind of use tools from, the last century, really, in terms of those approaches. So I'm really, confident that we will be able to look at how organisations are able to keep more of what they earn, and use that in a way that is much more about what they need to do and less about meeting the kind of regulatory commitments that we impose upon them. So shaking up the regulator a little bit more too, and having conversations that with the regulator that, this is not a precise kind of science. There's an art to community, and community is so so able to pivot quite quickly that, a regulator needs to be able to understand that and not have things quite so chiseled in stone. It needs to be much more about how we support things that change, and how organisations need to change and grow as well, and how we support them to do that. There's also pieces of work that we need to do, I think, to support good leadership, governance as well. We often, we find people that are hardworking, we pop them into spots, but they may not always have all of the tools that they should do to ensure their organisations can be as robust and as possible. But I do come back to the whole notion of sustainability too. How is it that our legislation or our regulations support sustainability? And that's about being able to, as an organisation, plan for 5-10 years in advance, or ahead rather, and be able to do that by holding on to reserves or building up your war chest, if that's what's required of you, and how we as the regulator actually support that to happen. I think there are some opportunities to kind of throw some ideas around, and to be perfectly honest, I haven't really understood the social enterprise end of it particularly well. And I'm coming to realise just how significant that can be to change the way we operate as community organisations. And charity, charity is a lovely thing, but it's defined in law that's 400 years old. And is that what we do these days? Is it about charity? I don't know. I think we need to have that conversation too.
Yeah, I think that in the social enterprise space, it's as much transforming businesses into social enterprise as it is transforming charities into social enterprises. And those who are serving our most vulnerable will always be reliant on grants and support to do that. So there is a limit to how much the social enterprise solution can support the community and voluntary sector, but definitely there's more support that can be given to that area, and there's far more potential there. Okay, so I encourage people to ask some questions now as we move into our final maybe 10 minutes. I have had one question come through, which is that the current government has targeted a suite of COVID economic recovery packages at small and medium businesses. Why have community organisations and charities been an afterthought in these policy approaches? For example, the wage subsidy package initially talked about businesses, not employers. And yes, we have seen that Lotto has done well in terms of income, so there is an additional 40 million available, which is great, and some other packages, but these often are packages that are seeking to meet the increased need that not-for-profits are dealing with, rather than the sector as employers and entities themselves.
That's yes, that's really interesting, because I can remember some of the early conversations we had during level 4 lockdown were from organisations that said they felt excluded from that conversation because they weren't specifically mentioned. And I know that for some we had to go back to the Ministry of Social Development, I think, and organise for specific funds for groups that had pivoted their business as usual to COVID but weren't included in that original cohort. I guess, part of that was to start off with, we were just trying to get money out the door to save people's jobs or keep people connected to their employment, and hadn't thought our way all the way through that. I hope that people are now seeing that there's a much more cohesive response to organisations, and that they are able to access the additional funding streams that are coming through. But yeah, it's it became a source of a little embarrassment, I guess, to me, that we're hugely reliant on the community sector to pivot very quickly, but that we kind of missed them out in the initial conversations and the initial kind of rollout of things. I have to say, though, as a result of that, though, I'm enormously proud of the work that has been initiated through my office, and that's supporting the foreign workers through the Red Cross, and that's a completely just crafted out of a need to support people who are here who have lost work and can't get back to their home countries. But in partnership with Red Cross, it demonstrates how you can do stuff. Really, just it needs to happen. We can do it, and we made it happen. So yeah, but look, I take that on board. I really hope the sector is feeling much more supported, that they are able to access resources. When Labor talks about its 5-point plan, we talk about jobs, and jobs mean our sector as much as it does business, and our response in terms of free apprenticeships. There are apprenticeships in the support area as well, which a lot of our organisations operate in, because we know that support services are so vital. So why not ensure that we have our people trained and that they can do that for free?
Great, thank you. There's another question that's come through, which starts off by saying thank you so much, Minister, for your hard work for the sector, and also coming along to talk today. And this question notes that you've talked a lot about changes that may need to be made to the regulator, including more support for the regulator, and that the sector needs more than a regulator in government. They need a voice to kind of represent them into government as well as the regulatory bit. So can you comment on how broad you see that role at the government department level being?
Well, I guess one of the constraints is being part of the Department of Internal Affairs. But if there is an ability to, and I don't want to, I don't want to make offers or create expectations about officers of community or ministries of the community and voluntary sector. But if there is a way for the community and voluntary sector to be represented in government, that is about supporting good research and robust new ideas, supporting ensuring that those things like developing strategy, for example, for the sector, or engagement between government and the sector are a feature, rather than what has been up to date, which has kind of been a bit programmatic. There's some great things going on. I mean, the community-led development initiative programs that have been running, that were instituted by the previous minister, Alfred Nuttall. Great. And sustainable, 3-year funding, community decides what is really important, and they get some pūtea to do this stuff. Those kinds of things are great, but it doesn't speak to building sustainability and longevity, and that's where the conversation needs to shift, and having a strategic view in partnership with all of the key components of the sector is where we need to lift it up a level, and actually see, as government, we've got levers that we can pull. We've got things that we can do in partnership with everyone else to really enhance our sector. I thought far too long have felt that the notion that we run on the smell of an oily rag, that's not appropriate anymore. The work we do is far too valuable for that, and we need to have good thinking, good strategy, and then enact the plan accordingly. So that's my take.
Great, and I think in terms of the time, this is the last question. So it links a little bit to your answer there. The question is around the fact that government and philanthropy are effectively co-funders of the same organisations in many instances, that currently the burden falls on the not-for-profit who seeks funding from government and then seeks funding from a grant maker. Have you got any ideas how to practically make that more seamless, so that it is true co-funding rather than the burden going on a community group to kind of approach the different types of funders?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I should say. The first is we have to as government, have a better relationship with the other funders. We have good relationships, but I don't know that we've actually had the conversation about how we do this better and more effectively. And I know there's willingness across both parties to do that. So that's a great start, right? Having a strategic vision about how these things happen, being directed by community about what their priorities are, so that informs those conversations that we have across. That's really important too. Having just engaging much more fulsomely is where we need to go. As a government, where are our strategic partners in the conversations that need to happen every day, not just when we're planning policy, or not just when we're looking at legislation. Where is the opportunity for you to engage with us in a fulsome and robust way all the time? And what does that structure look like? Now, I don't know the answer to that. I just know that it's a question that we need to ask, and we need to get answered in a decent way. Advisory groups aside, that doesn't really speak to how we help the development of the not-for-profits or civil society, or the development of greater democracy and representation and participation, which is all part of the work of civil society, right? So that's a commitment that I make, that I want to find out what that mechanism is with you all, and let's get that happening. That's probably going to take us a little while, but unless we have a structure in place, we're going to continue to bounce around as we have done. You have a strong kind of, if you have a strong foundation and a strong structure, then you know that there's longevity in that process too, and won't be easily dismantled. So let's do that together. Let's make that one of the first things that we kick off in terms of our work program.
That's a lovely note to end on, with that commitment, Minister. Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate your time today. We wish you all the best for the next little period, and to look after yourself in the tough time that campaigning is. And just thank you for tuning up, and thank you too to our audience today, and for the thoughtful questions they've put through.
Yeah, thank you so much. And look, thank you for always making sure that the hard questions are asked. I think it's really important. Thank you for everything that you do to help our communities thrive. And it's been really lovely having conversations. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.